Well, good afternoon, good morning to those of you on the Pacific Coast. Good afternoon to those in the Central and the East Coast and beyond. We welcome you to Spirit-Led Broadcast. We come to you every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And we're so thankful for you tuning in. Again, as we've said many times before, be sure to share this on your social media and invite others to join us. And we have a great honor today of having on our broadcast with us Dr. Dan Lane from Kairos University. And Dr. Dan serves as the academic dean for the Kairos University. And if I were to read his entire bio, it would take us about 5 minutes, but I'll give you a few just tips and points off the top of it. He received his PhD in Old Testament at the Trinity International University, the Evangelical Divinity School. He received his Master's of Divinity at the Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He received a BA in Electronics in Indiana University. He works with, as I mentioned, a faculty member and a academic dean here at Kairos University. At Wheaton College, he was the assistant professor and adjunct facility teacher. At Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, he was with the extension faculty there. At the Trinity Western Seminary in Canada, he was part of that faculty.
2 years.
Wheaton College, he was an instructor and also an adjunct faculty. At the Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where he got his degree, he also taught a fellow in Hebrew there. He was pastor of the Cavalier Evangelical Free Church. He also was a church administrator at a village church of Barrington, and he served quite a few years in the United States Air Force as an officer. And we're so happy to have you here today, Dr. Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking time to be with us. And we're so excited to kind of dive a little bit into your life, but we'd like to just take a few minutes and we'd like to just talk about Kairos University. Kind of give us an idea how Kairos University got started and how you became connected with Kairos, and then we'll kind of dive into some of the details of your life.
Well, the roots of Kairos University are connected to a sister school called Kairos International University. Kairos International University teaches overseas, and before COVID, primarily in Southeast Asia. And so I had taught for Kairos International University, had also been their academic dean, and then as not knowing COVID was coming, but as 2017, 2018 were approaching, doors seemed to be opening for us in the Southern California area. That there were students that were expressing interest, students for whom taking 3 or 4 years out of their life to go to traditional Bible college or traditional seminary just wasn't viable. I had the privilege of doing that. I went 4 years on campus for an undergraduate degree, 3 years on campus for my M.Div, and 3 or 4, depending on how you define it, years on campus for my doctorate degree. I had the privilege of doing that. I have a long-suffering wife who has traveled with me to these places, and her employment has helped fund me. But for some people, that is just not a viable option to take 3 or 4 years out of their life and go. And yet we would talk, and as our orbit of connections and people we met as it expanded, we would run into people who are serving in the ministry or who are a strong lay leader in their church, and they're sensing the call of God, to step up and go into the ministry, and yet they know that their Bible training and their theology training is pretty slim. So we saw a need for that. My direct supervisor is Dr. Grace Choi Kim, and she lives in the Southern California area. She was in touch with friends and with colleagues who said, we think there is a need that could be served by a school that, instead of setting up a regular campus, would schedule courses that would typically meet on the weekends and the evenings. And when we are in person, we typically meet for about 2 weeks of Saturdays and evenings. If we teach online, those courses will last 4, 5, or 6 weeks, just maybe 8 for some classes, depending on the nature of the material and how many assignments a student really should get done before we go to the next segment. So those things can vary. But we found that we began to conclude that there was a need that we could serve by offering a very solid biblical and theological and ministry education training, and yet doing so in a way that didn't require people to pull up and uproot and move.
You know, Dr. Dan, that's such a beautiful thing, because so many institutions of learning, especially colleges, have discovered the value of doing school online, letting people to either learn at their pace or, not having to fight traffic and deal with all the things. And I found that, online training is very, very beneficial. Now, I want to dive a little bit into your life, if we can.
Okay.
And we have a good friend here that's on, John Paul Jones. He's from Indiana, so I'm sure he'll appreciate this. But Dr. Dan came from
Indiana,
Indianapolis about 70 years ago. We'll leave it at about.
About that, give or take a few decades.
And so you went to schools in Indianapolis from kindergarten all the way to 12. Is that correct?
Good, excellent quality public schools.
And you served in the United States Air Force from 1974 to about 1984.
For a decade.
Mostly you was in North Dakota.
Dakota.
Anything you want to share about your time in the service? Or?
In North Dakota, we were mostly protecting the United States from the threat of an imminent invasion by Canada. We actually get along with our Canadian, within a normal amount of teasing back and forth about how words are to be pronounced. We get along with our Canadian brothers quite well. I served 10 years in the Air Force in North Dakota. I was occasionally assigned somewhere else for a couple of months for training in a specific area, but this place I was stationed was North Dakota. The closest town is Grand Forks, North Dakota. People have heard of Fargo and Minot and even and Bismarck. So Grand Forks is the fourth town that's relatively large in North Dakota. For those of you from big cities, it's still small, 60, 70,000, that's it. But that's where I was stationed. And I always had the sense that I wasn't going to stay in the Air Force for life, that I had this draw toward ministry, toward service for the kingdom in some capacity, and I wasn't quite sure exactly how that would flesh out. And I remember there were times in the Air Force when I was doing my job, doing my duty in good faith, but I'm kind of wondering, what is it that I'm doing here that, in terms of what I hope to be doing in the kingdom, that's helping prepare me for that. And that thought would run around in my head. But a couple of the jobs that I had, especially my last 3 or 4 years in the Air Force, involved planning and administering and organizing and communicating. And when you're in the military, you really have to do those things, because if you don't, they will put you in jail for the rest of your life or take you out and have you shot. So well, okay, not too often, but you have to do it. You have to sit down and figure out, how are we going to do this? How can I write this up so that the other people that are affected by this can actually read it and understand what they are supposed to do in case a building catches on fire? I was one of the people who wrote up emergency response checklists, things like that. And so, interestingly, what I found was that training was absolutely crucial in preparing me for the administrative side of what I do now. I am the academic dean for Kairos University, and allow me to finish one statement. I started with Kairos International University overseas. That's our sister school. And then when we began to see the need for the teaching that we could provide and the way we could provide it stateside, it's a little bit cleaner administratively for the stateside school than to simply be Kairos University. So we are sister schools. We are like-minded. Some of the same people serve in various capacities. Administratively and legally, we are distinct. But then we began in 2018, started teaching then stateside and soon online through Kairos University. Well, back to the Air Force then. So there I am, and I'm doing all this administrative work, organizing things, and I have to confess, the first time they said, okay, Captain Lane, this will be your next assignment. You'll be in charge of this office that keeps the plans current and does this. My first thought was, dear God, come take me home to heaven. This is it. I don't want to do this. What I found, to my surprise, was when I actually would review some large written thing, bring it up to date, maybe organize it a little better, clean up the language so that when you read it, you actually knew what to do. And when that was done, and then I would send copies to the offices that were affected, I found a surprising sense of satisfaction doing that. And that took me by surprise, that I would be content doing what you might call office work. But it's it's not just filing and stuff. It's planning, it's thinking, it's organizing, communicating, arranging, and that has helped prepare me for the other side of my duties. Half of my duties is teaching, which I love, and then the other half is the administrative planning, writing up the documents you have to have to be an accredited university.
So, Dr. Dan, you left the Air Force and you went to the seminary for your stint there.
For the first time at seminary was a 3-year program called a Master of Divinity and M.Div.
And from there, you went to pastor a church in North Dakota, in a very cold place.
Yes. God has a sense of humor. I was in North Dakota, in the Air Force in North Dakota for 10 years. And when I left the Air Force, I'm not kidding, when I drove out of North Dakota across the bridge that takes you into Minnesota, I looked in the rearview mirror of my car and I went, bye-bye. That I was not going to come back to North Dakota again, except my wife was born and raised there. We have family there. So, we would go back to see family, but that was it. I was done with North Dakota. I was gone. What I did not know is the angels up in heaven are laughing at me then, because they know that 3 years later, I will accept a call to a rural church in North Dakota in a smaller town further north. And so I served as a pastor there in the little town of Cavalier, North Dakota, for 5 years.
So about that time, when you decided to after that pastorate to go back to continue your education and pursue
a doctorate degree.
And it's kind of focused in the Old Testament. Why don't you talk about how that came about and how God has a sense of humor with that?
Over time, I had the church that I served in the 5 years I was there. No one died in the church. Obviously, people died in America, but no one in the church actually died. I had very few people in the hospital. And unlike some of my fellow pastors who are doing a funeral twice a month, who are going to the hospital every day, I had the privilege of really investing time in Scripture, of the things that I would learn about in seminary that I would think to myself, someday I really want to get back into that passage. I want to work through that. I want to really think through the whole book of Hebrews, just read through it, think through it. I had the privilege of doing that as a pastor. And a lot of my pastoral friends, God bless them, they are up to their eyeballs with things that have to happen now. And they get to Saturday afternoon and they haven't started on their sermon yet. And I was in the situation where I had the privilege of investing a lot of time in the Scripture. And in God's grace, He gave me a congregation that was glad to have someone who opened the Scriptures. I'll allow one comment. When I announced that I was leaving, and the congregation then formed a job description for the new pastor, for their pastoral search, there was a line in there that went something to this effect, that careful, thoughtful exposition of the Scriptures have been a hallmark of our pulpit, which we wish to see continued. And that did my heart good to see that. So at the personal level then, just my interest in understanding the Scriptures and teaching them just kind of grew, and I began to feel myself drawn more toward the teaching end of things. And so at the end of 5 years, I had a good parting with the church. We were on good terms. For those of you who've served in the ministry, you know that is not always the case, that you have ups and downs. And in my 5 years there were some ups and downs. But at the end of the 5 years, I felt like the church and I, my wife and I and the church were on a good footing together. And to this day, we have good friends in that little town of Cavalier, North Dakota. We have good friends from that church to this day, 2.5 decades later.
So Old Testament wasn't something that you were particularly interested in growing up or really caught your attention. But then God directed you to pursue your doctorate
in Old Testament. When I was young, I knew, like a lot of Christians, I knew the names: Moses, David, Abraham. I'd kind of heard Nehemiah. I wasn't quite sure where he fit in. And so I'd heard these things. And I remember just wondering, all those little books at the end of the Old Testament, Amos, Obadiah, whatever. What are those? I had no clue what 1st and 2nd Kings or 1st and 2nd Chronicles were about. I had no clue. And somewhere had gained the impression that apart from knowing that God created the heavens and the earth, and knowing that He gave us the 10 Commandments, and a Messiah was coming, and the book of Psalms was very comforting, my read was, apart from that, I guess that's about it for the Old Testament. It happened that when I finished college, so we're backing up just a little bit. When I finished college, I had some free time before I reported for active duty, and as a guest, I attended at the time Campus Crusade for Christ, now Cru. I attended their kind of 1 month of basic training, Old Testament survey, New Testament survey, communication, and fundamental doctrine. Old Testament survey, I remember, this is true, as God is my witness, I thought, Old Testament survey, 4 hours a day for 2 solid weeks, Monday through Friday. I went, dear God, I said, there's not that much Old Testament worth surveying.
I just went through it.
I actually mumbled that to myself out loud. But the professor that crew had brought in to teach is a gentleman named Walter Kaiser. And I am not sure if he is still with us or if he's with the Lord now. But when they brought him in, he was a professor of Old Testament at the school I wound up going to, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He would eventually serve as their academic dean, and then he would eventually serve, I'm pretty confident, as the president of Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, again for about a decade. And I'm here to tell you, if you were in Walter Kaiser's class, he did not put you to sleep. And he taught me things about the Old Testament and opened my eyes to what was going on in it and the passages in it. And I realized there is a ton of good stuff in here. And one of my funny reactions was anger that this had not been opened up to me before.
You know, Dr. Dan, just having personal experience now, coming through a whole week of hearing you teach on hermeneutics and
how to interpret the Bible.
Right, how to interpret the Bible and the understanding of the genres of the Bible. And the 6 different categories that are
they're kind of a helpful set of categories to bear in mind.
Yeah, to help understand the Old Testament. And even though I never had these tools to rightly divide the word, as Paul said to Timothy, I grew up in a denomination that we really embraced the Old Testament. Preached a lot from it. And just because it's a lot of concept. I know back in August of 2018. Andy Stanley had brought a controversial statement. He argued in a sermon that he gave, and his statement was that the Christian faith must be unhitched from the Old Testament. And a lot of times people have this concept that, the Old Testament is this archaic old book that should just be set aside. It's not relevant. It's not part of this day. They even say it's under the old law and only want to embrace the New Testament. And you've brought some really great points in this teaching this week. We certainly can't go back and revisit them all. But what would your answer be to someone who, like Andy Stanley, who said that we must unhitch our Christian faith from the Old Testament, that is no longer relevant and it's no longer for today? Out
of fairness to Andy Stanley, I have not heard that statement myself, but I've heard a couple of people relay it, that he said something like, go unhitch the faith from the Old Testament. I understand one aspect of where he's coming from. We don't live by all of those laws now. In the Old Testament, one of the laws was you cannot mix cotton and wool. So we tease, no cotton polyester shirts. You can't do that. All kinds of animals you couldn't eat.
Shrimp or
and
pork.
No shrimp, no pork, no bacon cheeseburgers. And at one point, I can hear what he's saying, because there are a lot of laws that Israel had that were for Israel in the Old Testament that we are not under now. On the other hand, I suspect that if I had a patient conversation with him, there are some things he would acknowledge from the Old Testament that are absolutely foundational to the New Testament. Where do we get our doctrine of creation from? Genesis chapter 1. The first 3 chapters of the Old Testament are absolutely foundational to a biblical view of human nature. That we have this image of God we're created in. So Paul and Jesus in the New Testament talk about even people who are self-serving and kind of evil, or even the Gentiles, when they're just making summarizing statements, recognize things that are right and wrong. That even selfish Gentiles will still be good to their own children, and that they acknowledge that certain things are fundamentally right and wrong. And Christian thinkers through the centuries have said that is the image of God in everybody, whether or not they revere God or not.
Of course, let me forgive me for breaking in, but I want to make sure we clarify. We're not here trying to disrespect or expose Andy Stanley, because I do believe he came back at Christianity Today in an article and an interview with them and clarify where he came from. But I do know, though, from that statement, I for fact know there's a whole generation of younger pastors and preachers that decided that, we're just leave it be. I was talking just recently with a a minister here in the Orange County that sat across the coffee house at Starbucks and said, "I do not preach from the Old Testament."
Wow.
And he was basically also insinuating to me, please don't preach from the Old Testament if you preach here. And
Wow.
and I understand the heart of like what Andy Stanley said, recognizing that, of course, we don't sit down and make sure that we're eating something that is cloven hoof, but chews the cud.
We don't have to
and
worry
all
about
these
that
little,
anymore.
Because even look at the Pharisees. When Jesus said you strain a gnat but swallow a camel, and he talked about just the craziness of how they even though they obeyed the law on the surface, it wasn't in the heart.
Something in their heart wasn't.
Yeah, and then of course you taught yesterday. I was talking about how they were. Maybe this was just a statement being made. How some Pharisees they live by the spoken law that actually overruled the
at
written.
The practical level. That within the Pharisees, they accepted not only the written scriptures, which they very much accepted, forgive me, but they also accepted the authority of what is called the oral, O-R-A-L, the oral law that had been passed down, not in writing, but just by one generation telling the next and telling the next, that they accepted the authority of that. And some of the oral laws had the effect of letting you skirt around the straightforward statements of the written law.
And I can't remember where I read this, but I read a study on even how far the Pharisees took the law, that they would even put rules that you could not wear sandals on Sunday. Peradventure, a thorn got caught in the sandal, and peradventure you drug it in the sand, and peradventure of seed was blown by the wind into that little furrow, and it took root, and thus you broke the Sabbath because you planted on Sunday.
Okay.
And so, from that point of view, I get it with some of the younger charismatic generation, but I really think it's been so refreshing, so many of the statements that you've made about this. So I know you wanted to say something about that particular thing.
The example Brother John just pointed out, that's not scripture.
No.
That's an extreme example of oral tradition. Make two quick statements. Charles Stanley has done excellent work for decades.
Yes.
And I remember listening to Andy Stanley one time introducing the book of Philippians. This is some years ago, a decade or more. And I was just in the car, driving, listening. And I remember thinking, that is the best summarizing introduction to the book of Philippians that sets the stage for it that he did in 10, maybe 15 minutes. It wasn't 2 hours. It wasn't 2 minutes, something like that. That is the best summarizing start to set the stage for understanding the book of Philippians that I have ever heard. So the men do good work. Here's what, in terms of the Old Testament, part of what you run into is people have not read it enough. They have not understood it well enough to know what to do with it. Yes, it's true. We don't have to kill sheep and goats anymore. I'm grateful for that. But Jesus refers to the Old Testament. He says it's from God. It's true, and you cannot break it. David talks about the law coming from God and filling his mind and leading him. The Apostle Paul looks back and he refers to the law as good and holy. And in one place in Romans, he says the law is actually kind of spiritual. Now, can it be approached in a manner that is very mechanical? Yes. So what I would suggest is this, is that some of our brothers and sisters who don't have much of a feel for, just don't think they have much use for the Old Testament, I'm going to suggest they have not either benefited from a teacher that could open it up, or they have not invested the time to really work through and look through and see what is it saying and how do these things still speak to us. I will submit that the book of Proverbs has practical wisdom that no other book has. The book of Ecclesiastes wrestles an issue. Can we live without God and be satisfied? It wrestles an issue in a direct way that no other book of the Bible does. The book of Job wrestles a question in a way that no other book of the Bible does. It wrestles the question, what if you are a God-fearing person and you are living a commendable life and the world just seems to dump on you and everything seems to go wrong? Do we have to conclude, boy, I must have sinned in a big way for God to be doing this to me? The book of Job wrestles that question directly in a way that no other scripture does. There is nothing comparable to Isaiah chapter 40 through 48 in the entire Bible. Nothing. It is absolutely foundational to our view of God. So I would submit that there's that if you actually invest the time or have the benefit of having a good teacher to walk you through the Old Testament, get your bearings so that you can read it with benefit, there's a lot going on there that is great stuff to preach. I will admit, no, I do not preach through the genealogies in the first 9 chapters of Chronicles, but those genealogies are there for a reason.
Yes, they are.
They are there to tell you these are real people.
That's
this
right.
really happened. This is not once upon a time, or this is not in a land far away a long time ago. No, these are real people. They trace it from Adam down to David.
Especially see someone like Rahab, who
Mhm.
was a prostitute,
A Canaanite prostitute. Yeah.
but because of her obedience,
Mhm. She turned to the one true living God.
right,
Mhm.
and became part of that
It-
flow.
It is interesting. Rahab has all the strikes against her in the Old Testament. She is a Canaanite. She's a Canaanite. She's a woman, which didn't help socially back then, and she's a prostitute. On occasion, some Bibles try to be polite and say maybe she was an innkeeper, but James in his epistle
Yes,
refers to her as Rahab the Porne,
right.
the word from which we get pornography. Rahab the prostitute, Rahab the harlot. Matter of fact. But what is interesting is this: in the book of James, when he picks 2 people from the Old Testament,
Come on,
a whopping 2 who exemplify faith, you kind of have to pick Abraham. And after that, he picks Rahab,
there you go.
a Gentile prostitute who turned to God in faith, and the scriptures make it clear God accepted her, and she became part of God's family.
So, Dr. Dan, you told me a story when I first met you in the office. You was talking about how when you first met Dr. Grace Kim, how it was just the fact that you were 2 people studying in a library.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how God used that chance meeting in, of all places, Chicago, Illinois,
Mm-hmm.
to begin this journey of Kairos.
Dr. Grace Kim lives in the Los Angeles area. I live in the suburbs of Chicago. And I got my degrees through Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, which is a major part of the larger school, Trinity International University. Dr. Grace studied and completed part of a degree there, which she finished at a different school. In the year 2014, my teaching load through Wheaton College, which I was very happy to teach at, it's an excellent school, my teaching load that particular semester was relatively light, shall we say. So my schedule was very flexible. And I would simply go attend and do things that normally I wouldn't do because I was too busy. And so I heard there was kind of a lunchtime discussion of a topic that interested me at Trinity's library. And they've redesigned the library so that there's an area where you can kind of chat and talk. And then the further you get into the library, you get quieter and quieter. So it's laid out well, it's laid out smart. So they can have what you might call a bag lunch. Well, they were having a bag lunch on a topic that interested me. So I thought, I'll go. So I drive and I'm there. And when the bag lunch time is done, Dr. Grace Choi Kim came over to my table. She was looking for another professor who I knew. He had to leave right away to go teach a class. So as soon as the bag lunch was done, he said, Daniel, good to see you. I got to go. Boom, he was gone. So Dr. Grace Choi Kim comes up. She's looking for the other professor. And I extended his apologies that he's teaching right now. He's not available. She recognized me. And she said, I remember you from the library here back when we were both students, which is years earlier. And she said, did you finish your degree? I said, yes. She said, what was your doctorate in? I said, Old Testament. And Dr. Grace does not beat around the bush. She said, would you be open to teaching overseas in Southeast Asia? Now, I must confess, if at that time I had been the academic dean of a Christian university that had good funding, maybe its own basketball and football team, and had a corner office with staff, I probably would have given her my card and said, well, have your people contact my people. I probably would have done something like that. But at the time, my schedule was very flexible. And so we that day, we only had 10 minutes to talk. And then we met the next day and talked for 2 hours. And she shared with me what at the time then Kairos International University was going to be doing overseas. The interesting thing is this: I had not been on that campus for 2 years. And Dr. Grace had not been on that campus for 10 years.
Wow.
And amazing. As John Calvin would say, it just so happened that we were there on the same day, in the same building, and crossed paths. I don't use the word divine appointment lightly in my own life.
Right.
I think that was one.
Well, I certainly wanted to pause and say that if you're interested in receiving some teaching and training from Dr. Dan in hermeneutics and Old Testament survey, New Testament survey, and the different things that he and other wonderful professors at Kairos University want to offer. Just visit the website on the screen, www.kairos.eau.edu, and you can get more information.
Oh, forgive. It's Kairos.aeu.edu.
Oh,
forgive
my
me. There's
dyslexia
a
kicked
little
in.
typo. It's
AEU.
Kairos.aeu.edu.
Yes, please forgive me.
I don't know if that can be repaired. quickly
Yeah,
here.
we can repair that, but
It's AEU.
I have a habit of my dyslexia kicks in, and I always flip numbers, and I flip. Got it fixed now, so there we go. www.kairos.aeu.edu.
The school's address changed about a year ago, and I sent emails out to people who support and pray for
I'm
us.
trying to change.
I got the address wrong.
I'm trying to change how I say this because Dr. Dan articulates it Kairos. So I'm trying to train myself to say Kairos, not Kairos.
Yeah, it looks like Kairos, but the underlying Greek word from which it's drawn would more likely be pronounced.
I love
Kairos.
his enunciation of Hebrew and Greek. I wish I could just capture that gift because I always slaughter when I try to speak.
It was beat into me over several semesters of seminary training.
So 2015, you made the trip to Vietnam and Malaysia, and you spent some time there. Why don't you talk a little bit about that time in Vietnam and Malaysia?
How are we doing?
Yeah, we're doing pretty good. We got about 5 minutes, and we'll wrap up.
Traveled to Southeast Asia the first time and made connections with a host church in Malaysia where we will be teaching, and over time I have taught some in the Philippines, some in Thailand, some in Cambodia, and I remember coming home from one of the 2-week teaching sessions that was just particularly satisfying. Students paid very good attention, and they were warm and friendly and embracing. When I came home back to my home church, and I'm simply teaching Sunday school a few weeks later, I said, in terms of my teaching ministry, I said, I will die a satisfied man for those 2 weeks of teaching in Southeast Asia. The students paid such good attention. They were so hungry. I'm coming from a little different place in terms of my family's heritage than some of my students are. So it wasn't my goal to attack them and change. But I would sometimes say, here's how, in terms of my training and understanding, here's how I see this issue biblically. And I wouldn't make it a true false question on exams, but I would want them to hear me out. And they would listen. They absorbed the word. And so my teaching overseas was very satisfying. And then when COVID hit and the brakes got put on that, and it took us a while to get up and running with online courses that could work. When COVID hit, we had already begun teaching as Kairos University here stateside, and very quickly then shifted relatively easily to shift to online courses when you're all teaching in the same language. When you're going through translating into Chinese or another language, it's just more complicated to teach online.
I was going to ask you that too. I did have the grace and the opportunity to be able to travel and speak at conferences in KL, and in Penang, and in Malacca. These are cities in Malaysia. And most of those conferences, I didn't have to speak to an interpreter. I didn't have to have it interpreted to Malay. They grasped English pretty good. But when I was in Vietnam, in Ho Chi Minh City, now it used to be called Saigon, but I had to teach through an interpreter in Vietnamese, and it sure changes the cadence and the flow of teaching quite a bit. So did you have to teach in Malay and Vietnamese, or?
When I was in Malaysia, most of the students understood English pretty well, but it's one thing to have a slow, friendly conversation. It's another thing to be teaching, biblical concepts, and it's not theologically, it's not this, but it's this, and explaining the subtle differences. So even though I could have conversations with almost all of the students in our host site at Malaysia, we choose to go ahead and have a translator in the class who translates into Chinese. And I can see the students, they're listening to me when I speak, and then when the Chinese translator speaks, I can sometimes see their eyes going, oh, okay, and now they can see it. So at the level of casual conversation, I could talk to almost any student in the class. When it came to more formal teaching, I think it does work best in that case to have a translator.
Well, Dr. Dan, it's been a joy to talk with you today.
Thank you.
And I know I've just barely met you, but after hearing your story and hearing the heart of Kairos, there we go.
Kairos.
Just wanted to share you with our listening audience. And I want to really highly recommend this university if you're looking to get a Bachelor's of Science, or if you want to go on into your master's or even a doctorate. And they're able to facilitate you along the journey. And they can do it online as well as in person. And thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you for your service in the Air Force. And just thank you for what you've done coming here and teaching this week.
John, glad to be doing it, and thank you for having me on today.
Well, God bless you. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next Tuesday. Remember, we've got Apostle John P. Kelly is going to be with us, and certainly looking forward to hear what he has to say. And God bless you. Have a wonderful day. All right.